Good morning. It is Thursday, March 26th. It was good to see you all last night through our Activate Zoom conversation. Hope you all enjoyed that. I'm looking forward to at least a couple more weeks of doing that together. So thanks for tuning into that. And this morning, we are continuing our study in the book of Philippians. So Philippians chapter 2, verses 1 through 4 is our text for this morning, where we read Paul, who writes this: "Therefore, if there is any encouragement in Christ, if there is any consolation of love, if there is any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affection and compassion, make my joy complete by being of the same mind, maintaining the same love, united in spirit, intent on one purpose. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others." These are familiar words in the book of Philippians. As we've seen in many texts, there's a lot of familiar words in the book of Philippians. But this morning is especially well known because of its focus on unity. Unity. It's clear throughout this passage as we just kind of scan through. If there's, he asks if there's any encouragement, if there's any consolation, fellowship of the Spirit, affection, compassion, make my joy complete by being of the same mind, same love, united in spirit, intent on one purpose. Those are all unity terms. He says, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Don't look out for your own personal interests, but for the interests of others. All of those terms are terms of unity that Paul employs throughout this whole text. So it's fair to say that unity is the theme of Philippians 2, 1 through 4. And we're going to break this down and see exactly what Paul is seeking to communicate about this topic of unity. He starts in verse 1 by giving a series of if statements, and he's going to follow it with a then statement. But as we kind of break down verse 1, you see, if there's any encouragement in Christ, if there's any consolation of love, if there's any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affection or compassion. And Paul isn't necessarily saying those from a doubtful perspective. Like, he's not saying, I don't know if there actually is any. It's almost as if we could translate those words if as since or because there's encouragement of Christ. If there's any consolation of love, then he's going to call them to do something. And he knows that is there in the Philippians. And so he's calling them to examine and see if these things are in themselves. And because they are, he's going to direct them towards the specific call of unity. So we break that down. He says, if there's any encouragement in Christ, if you are a group of people who find encouragement in Christ, if there is any consolation, or another way to understand that word would be if there's any comfort of love, if you are someone who finds comfort in the love between believers, he continues, if there's any fellowship of the Spirit, or another way to say that would be like, if there's any fellowship of those who are in the Spirit, those who have the Spirit within them, if there's fellowship between them. He gives a last if statement. He says, if there's any affection, it's like just affinity or love. If there's affection or compassion, concern for one another. If those things are true, and here's the key, those things are always true in the life of a believer. Believers find encouragement in Christ. Believers find comfort in love. Believers find fellowship with those in the Spirit. Believers have affection and compassion for one another. These are key marks in the life of a believer. And so he's saying, if these things are true, in other words, if you are a Christian, if you're a Christian, then I'm going to give you a specific call. And so we could break down this first verse in light of Paul's theme of unity. We could break down this first verse to be the basis of unity. This is the basis of unity. If you're a Christian, if there's encouragement in Christ, comfort and love, fellowship of the Spirit, affection and compassion, if those things are true and they ought to be in the life of a believer, then what should take place? Well, that is when Paul transitions to a second point here, a second point under his topic of unity. And he calls them with a very personal call. He says, make my joy complete. Paul says, you know what would make me completely happy, completely joyful? You know what would complete my joy? And his call for them in order to complete his joy and to fulfill their role as Christians is to be of the same mind, maintain the same love, be united in spirit, and be intent on one purpose. This is, in many ways, it really is the center of this verse. This is the center call, the center command. This is the call to unity. And so we could break this second verse down this way. First, we had the basis of unity if you're a Christian. This here is the call to unity. The call to unity. He says, here's what would bring me utter joy. Be of the same mind, maintain the same love, be united in spirit, be intent on one purpose. In this first expression, he calls them to be of the same mind. That is to say, you need to think the same way. You need to be people who are of one mind. Now, the church is always notably diverse, even across our youth group. There's all sorts of different people that think all sorts of different ways, and that's a beautiful part of the church. And yet, ultimately, we're called to all have the same mind. In other words, we don't think like unbelievers. We think like one another. And we may think different things at different times. He's not saying that we all need to have identical thoughts. We're going to bring our unique thoughts and contributions to the church, and the church is healthy because of it. But he is saying you all need to be of a renewed mind. You all need to be thinking as believers, and because you're all believers, you all need to be thinking the same in that way. All of you with renewed minds pursuing Christ. So he says, be of the same mind. That is the mind of a believer, a renewed and a redeemed mind. He continues also, maintain the same love. The same love. Between all of those in the church, there's to be this common bond, this common unity of love. He says, maintain that. You need to all have that for one another. Love is not a gift that one believer has and another doesn't. We all maintain that together. So he says, maintain that same love. He says, be united in spirit, in your hearts, in your souls, in your spirit. Be one. We're going to have all sorts of different physical differences, but our hearts need to be united together. And he continues that by saying, be intent on one purpose. We are pursuing one goal. We're all in this together. Okay, so these calls in verse 2, be of the same mind, maintain the same love, be united in spirit, be intent on one purpose. All of that, Paul is saying, be unified. That's his call. It's the central call of these verses, and it's the call in verse 2. You must be unified, same mind, same love, united in spirit, intent on one purpose. This is the unity of the church. Well, the question that we have to ask is, how do we do that? And that is the question that Paul answers in the last two verses. How do we be unified? How do we be of the same mind, maintaining the same love, united in spirit, intent on one purpose? How do we do these things? Well, he answers that question here. In verses 3 and 4, he says, here's the path to unity. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interest, but also for the interests of others. In those words, Paul lays out the path to unity. Now, it's important that we state that this assumes the basis of unity is already in place. You will not be unified if you're not a Christian, but if you are a Christian, there's still work that we need to do to be unified. And Paul lays out that path in verse 3. He says, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit. He's going to, throughout these two verses, give negative statements first and then positive statements. He contrasts two different commands here. So first we have a negative statement, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but, and here's the positive, rather than doing the negative, with humility of mind, regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not, in verse 4, there's another negative, merely look out for your own personal interest, but also for, and here's the positive, the interests of others. You see him going back and forth between those negative and positive statements. He says, in what is an extreme call, do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit. That is to say, Evaluate your own motives. And as you see selfish desires manifesting themselves in your life, don't do those things. Run from them. Strike them from your life. Dig into your heart and evaluate your motives. Are you doing things from selfishness, from conceit, worthless and empty conceit? Don't do that. But rather with humility, and these things certainly demand humility, to deny yourself of selfishness, to deny yourself of these things demands that you are being humble. He says, with humility of mind, regard one another, look at this statement, as more important than yourselves. To regard someone is to consider them. This is something that's taking place in the mind. He actually says it in verse 3. With humility of mind, in your mind, you need to regard or consider one another as more important. That is so key. You need to, as a Christian, consider every other Christian as more important than you. That's his call. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but look around the room and determine in your heart, determine in your mind that every other person is more important than you. This is the attitude this is the path to unity, which makes so much sense. Imagine in the church if every single person were doing that. If every single person were looking around the room and saying, I'm the least important person in this room. You're more important than me. You're more important than me. You're more important than me. If we all maintain that attitude, what a unifying environment that would be. Well, Paul continues on that same trend in verse 4. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. The interest of others is what we are to be about. He's saying stop. That word merely, actually, that's supplied by modern translators, but that isn't actually there in the Greek. He's saying don't look out for yourself. You're gonna look out for yourself. Like when you get up in the morning and feed yourself, you automatically look out for yourself. He's saying don't do that. That's why those translators supply that word merely. He's not calling them to do harm to themselves. He's saying stop looking out for yourself. You do that on autopilot. We need to be about the work of looking out for the interests of others. Look out for the interests of others. This is the path of unity that the church determines to not be about our own selfish desires, to not look out for our own personal interests, but to fill our hearts with the pursuit of the interests of others because we regard others as more important than us. This is a progression throughout this whole text. If there is a unity in verse 1, if there's a unity, then the call to unity applies. If the call of unity applies to you, then you need to be putting into practice the path of unity. Okay, so if you're a Christian, then you need to submit to the call to unity, and you need to embrace the path to unity. And we could also take that backwards. If you are applying this path of unity, doing nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind, regarding one another as more important than yourselves, if you're doing that, that will bring about the unity of verse 2. And if the unity of verse 2 is in place based on the application of verses 3 and 4, then that will affirm that this is a church filled with Christians who do have encouragement in Christ and comfort of love and fellowship of the Spirit and affection of compassion. So these things, as we move progressively backwards in this text, affirm one another. These are huge. Students, we need to embrace these together. You need to start putting practices of unity into your life, considering the other students in our ministry, even other adults in our church, as more important than yourself. Be about the work of serving one another. And what we're going to see in our text tomorrow is that Christ is our ultimate example of that in Philippians 2, verses 5 and following. Determine these things, look back at verse 2, in your mind. Determine these things in your mind. This command in verse 3 to regard one another, remember that takes place in the mind. If we are fulfilling verse 3, we are being of the same mind. These two are united together. If we are not looking out for our own personal interest, but for the interest of others, if our purpose is to look out for the interests of others, look at this. Our purposes are united. This is a loving action. Our loves are united. So we are fulfilling what Paul calls us to do as we embrace the commands of verses 3 and 4. So let me encourage you to do that. I think this is one of those texts where the application is just painfully obvious. So I'm going to write them out, and there's a lot of overlap between them, but I think you'll be tracking with me here. Number 1, pursue unity. Pursue unity. Embrace the call of verse 2. How do we do that? I'm not going to write this all out. Let me just write 3. Let me fix that. Let me first write verse 3, because it's literally a command that we can directly apply, and verse 4. Those are direct commands that we can apply to our lives. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit, but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. A direct command. Do not look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. So that's our text for this morning. Certainly lots of application as we are, remember, continuing from yesterday morning in how we are to walk worthy of the gospel of Jesus Christ. We walk worthy of the gospel as we pursue unity together. So let's embrace that. Let's find ways to continue to do that, even as we're not able to spend time together. Text each other, communicate with each other, call each other, FaceTime, whatever it is that you can do to continue to encourage one another, to be unified with one another. Let's pursue those things together. So I hope that that's helpful for you. Hope you have a great day. Thanks for being with us this morning, and we will see you tomorrow.